Welcome to this in-depth exploration of one of the most compelling and controversial aspects of modern criminal investigation, criminal profiling. Imagine you're an investigator standing in a crime scene with hundreds of leads, thousands of suspects, and virtually no clear direction on where to point your investigation. This is where criminal profiling enters the picture, and today we're going to dissect both its tremendous potential and its significant limitations in a way that will fundamentally change how you think about criminal justice. Criminal profiling, also known as offender profiling or criminal personality profiling, is the process by which law enforcement agencies attempt to identify the characteristics, behavior patterns, and personality traits of unknown offenders by analyzing the crime scene evidence, victimology, and behavioral patterns displayed during the commission of a crime. Now, let's start with the merits, and this is where the story becomes truly fascinating, because criminal profiling has genuinely revolutionized investigative work in numerous cases. First and foremost, criminal profiling serves as an exceptional time-saving tool that can significantly narrow down suspect pools in vast investigations where resources are limited and time is of the essence. Imagine a detective facing thousands of potential suspects. A well-constructed profile can effectively eliminate 80 to 90% of that list, directing precious investigative resources toward the most probable candidates, rather than chasing every possible lead down expensive and time-consuming rabbit holes. The case of John Duffy and David Mulcahy, the notorious railway rapists of London in the 1980s, exemplifies this perfectly. Profilers predicted the offenders would be in their 20s and 30s, living in North London near one of the railway stations, and employed in a manual labor job that provided them with transport and flexibility. And when investigators focused their efforts on this narrowed profile, they apprehended the suspects far more efficiently than they might have otherwise done. Secondly, criminal profiling provides psychological insight into the mindset and motivations of perpetrators, which can be absolutely invaluable for understanding why someone committed a crime, what emotional or psychological needs they were attempting to satisfy, and what circumstances might trigger their behavior in the future. This deeper understanding transforms criminal investigation from a purely mechanical process of collecting evidence into a nuanced psychological exploration that recognizes that criminals are complex human beings operating under specific mental frameworks and emotional conditions. For example, a profile might determine that a serial killer is committing murders because they're seeking power and control over their victims, which is fundamentally different from someone committing murder out of jealousy or financial desperation. And this distinction completely changes how investigators approach the case, what evidence becomes relevant, and how they might predict where the criminal will strike next. Thirdly, criminal profiling has proven remarkably effective in helping investigators understand victim selection patterns, which can be crucial in preventing future crimes. Profilers analyze whether a killer selects victims based on geographic proximity, specific physical characteristics, occupation, vulnerability, or accessibility. And this analysis can help law enforcement warn specific populations who might be at heightened risk, as was the case with the Yorkshire Ripper investigation, where profiling helped identify that the killer was targeting sex workers and drug-addicted women, allowing authorities to increase protection in these communities. Furthermore, criminal profiling can assist in the interrogation and interview process by providing investigators with psychological leverage points, emotional vulnerabilities, and communication strategies tailored to the specific personality type they're dealing with. A profile might reveal that a suspect is narcissistic and responds well to flattery and recognition, or that they're potentially empathetic and might be moved by appeals to their conscience or the suffering they've caused. And skilled interrogators armed with this psychological insight can conduct more effective interviews that extract truthful information rather than false confessions. Additionally, criminal profiling plays a vital preventative role in public safety by helping law enforcement agencies understand emerging criminal patterns and trends before they escalate into larger criminal enterprises. Profilers can identify when a single offense criminal is likely to reoffend, when a serial offender is escalating in frequency or violence, or when disparate crimes might actually be the work of the same individual, allowing authorities to intervene proactively rather than reactively. Now, let's shift our focus to the demerits and limitations of criminal profiling, because despite its valuable applications, this field is riddled with significant problems that have led to miscarriages of justice and wasted investigative resources. The most glaring weakness is the fundamental lack of scientific rigor and empirical validation that underpins much of criminal profiling theory. While profilers often present their conclusions with absolute certainty, the reality is that many profiling methods rest on anecdotal evidence, subjective interpretation, and educated guessing, rather than rigorous statistical analysis and peer-reviewed research. A profiler might claim that a killer is likely to be a white male in his 30s based on case studies they've examined, but without large-scale empirical data validating this correlation, they're essentially making an educated guess that could be completely wrong. And this is problematic because law enforcement agencies often act on these guesses with enormous consequences. Consider the tragic case of Richard Jewell, the security guard wrongly identified as a suspect in the 1996 Atlanta bombing because a psychological profile suggested the bomber would likely have a background in law enforcement or military, a desire for recognition, and a perceived grievance. Jewell matched these superficial characteristics and became the primary suspect despite having no actual evidence connecting him to the crime, and his life was essentially destroyed by a profile that proved to be spectacularly inaccurate. The actual bomber, Eric Rudolph, did not match the profile at all, demonstrating that even well-intentioned profiling can lead investigators catastrophically astray. Secondly, criminal profiling is profoundly vulnerable to confirmation bias, a cognitive phenomenon where investigators unconsciously seek evidence that confirms the profile, while ignoring or dismissing contradictory evidence. Once a profile has been created and presented to investigators, they begin filtering information through the lens of that profile. And when a suspect matches the profile but the evidence against them is weak or circumstantial, investigators may unconsciously interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting guilt rather than innocence, potentially leading to the conviction of innocent people. The case of the Central Park Five illustrates this perfectly. 5 teenagers of color were convicted of a violent crime they did not commit, partly because law enforcement was operating under demographic profiles that made them seem like plausible suspects, and confirmatory bias led investigators and prosecutors to present circumstantial evidence in the most damning light, while ignoring exculpatory evidence and the actual biological evidence that proved their innocence. Thirdly, criminal profiling has been criticized for perpetuating stereotyping and discrimination, particularly against minorities and marginalized communities, because profiles often reflect the unconscious biases of the profilers themselves. If a profiler believes that violent criminals are more likely to be young African-American males, for example, they will create profiles reflecting this bias, which then leads law enforcement to disproportionately scrutinize and investigate members of that community, which in turn creates the appearance that the demographic is more criminal-prone, when in reality, they're simply more heavily policed and arrested, creating a vicious cycle of institutional racism masquerading as scientific profiling. This is not a theoretical concern, but a documented reality. Communities of color are disproportionately subjected to police scrutiny and profiling, and criminal profiles often embed and reinforce these systemic inequities rather than transcending them. Furthermore, criminal profiling lacks specificity and is often so general that it could apply to hundreds or thousands of people in any given area. A profile that describes a killer as likely to be an adult male who may have experienced childhood trauma, difficulty with interpersonal relationships, and who might have a history of animal cruelty is so broad that it could describe virtually any male in the general population, making it nearly useless as a practical investigative tool. Critics have pointed out that profiles are often so vague and non-committal that they're essentially unfalsifiable. If the profile predicts correctly, profilers take credit, but if it predicts incorrectly, they simply claim that the suspect was an atypical offender who didn't follow normal patterns, a claim that cannot be tested or verified. Additionally, there is serious concern about tunnel vision induced by profiling, where investigators become so focused on the profile's predictions that they neglect other promising leads or alternative theories. This can result in the investigation missing the actual perpetrator because they don't fit the profile. Or worse, the investigation becoming so narrowly focused on profile matching that exculpatory evidence is overlooked. The case of the Beltway Sniper attacks in 2002 demonstrates this. The profile suggested a single shooter, but the actual perpetrators were two individuals working together, and the profile's misdirection caused investigators to waste precious time and resources pursuing the wrong theory. Moreover, criminal profiling relies heavily on the assumption that criminal behavior is consistent and predictable. But the reality is that criminal behavior is often random, chaotic, and influenced by momentary circumstances that have nothing to do with the offender's underlying personality or psychology. A killer might select their next victim based on pure chance because they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, not because of any underlying personality-driven selection criterion that a profiler could predict. This unpredictability is irreducible and makes profiling fundamentally limited in its capacity to predict behavior with accuracy. Additionally, the subjective nature of profiling means that different profilers examining the same crime scene might produce entirely different profiles based on their own training, experience, and interpretive frameworks, which raises serious questions about whether profiling is more of an art form than a science, and whether the conclusions reached are based on objective analysis or on the particular profiler's personal judgment and biases. There's also the practical reality that criminal profiling can be extraordinarily expensive and resource-intensive, requiring highly trained specialists and taking significant time that might be better spent on more productive investigative methods, like systematic canvassing, forensic analysis, or technological tracking. Given that many agencies operate with limited budgets, devoting significant resources to profiling might mean fewer resources for other investigative techniques that have greater empirical support. Finally, criminal profiling can actually harm investigations by creating expectations and frameworks that distort how investigators perceive evidence and suspects. Once a profile has been created and disseminated to an investigative team, it essentially sets up a narrative into which all subsequent evidence is interpreted, and this narrative power can be extraordinarily difficult to overcome even when evidence contradicts it, because humans are naturally drawn to narratives and find it psychologically difficult to abandon them once they've been established. In conclusion, criminal profiling presents a fascinating paradox. It has genuinely helped solve crimes and narrow investigative focus in particular cases, but it has also contributed to wrongful convictions, wasted resources, and the perpetuation of systemic bias in criminal justice. The ethical path forward is not to abandon profiling entirely, but to recognize its limitations, demand greater scientific rigor and empirical validation of profiling methods, implement stronger safeguards against confirmation bias and tunnel vision, ensure that profiling is used as one tool among many rather than as the foundation of an investigation, and most importantly, remain vigilant against the ways that profiling can embed and perpetuate discrimination against vulnerable and marginalized communities. Criminal profiling should be practiced with profound humility about its limitations, transparency about its methods and accuracy rates, and a commitment to using it in ways that enhance justice rather than undermine it. The stakes in criminal investigation are simply too high. Lives are at stake, both those of potential victims and those of accused individuals, to rely on profiling without understanding both its genuine value and its substantial risks. And our criminal justice system will be strengthened only when we bring both of these perspectives into balance and practice profiling as a carefully circumscribed tool rather than something approaching infallible science.